it, or they can tell you a positive story. You can derive benefit either way, which is why we also like to go watch stories about horrible psychopathic thugs. You know, and hopefully we're learning not to be like them, although there are additional advantages in that, you know, someone who, you might be say that someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty, and I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, and or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control.
So in the process of becoming the hero of your own story, things in the shadow like aggression or hate or other emotions that we regard as unhealthy can be channeled into healthy behavior. Again, when you're negotiating or competing or defending yourself, for example. Here's another great clip about integrating the shadow.
Little review of Jungian psychology. The first thing is, if you want to know about this, the proper source is Carl Jung's Collected Works, Volume 9, and there's two parts to Volume 9, A and B, published as separate texts. And Volume 9 is called Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, and the other one is called Ion. But in Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, there's a good discussion of the persona and the shadow. And the persona, you could say, is a good way of thinking about it. You know, you watch all those rom-coms where there's always kind of a beta male guy who's being real friendly and always failing miserably with the women because basically he's lying to himself and to them. He's a persona. And a persona is the face that you show to the world when you're trying to pretend and to convince yourself and others that you're, I would say, harmless, but we could say a good person. But a good person isn't harmless. A good person is capable of, well, maybe a good person is capable of anything, but is willing to hold that in abeyance. I read this interesting commentary a little while ago on a statement by Christ in the New Testament, and the statement generally interpreted is that the meek shall inherit the earth. But I was looking up the multiple translations of the word meek, and meek is actually derived from a Greek word, of course, because the Bible, at least some of the original forms of the Bible, were in Greek. And that word didn't exactly mean meek. It meant something like those who have weapons and the ability to use them, but determined to keep them sheathed, will inherit the world. And that means that people who are capable of force, let's say, but decide not to use it, are in the proper moral position. And Nietzsche commented on that a fair bit too. You know, he thought of most morality as cowardice, not because morality itself was cowardice, but because most people who are cowards disguise their cowardice as morality, and they claim that their harmlessness, which is actually a consequence of their fear and inability to be harmful, say, or to be dangerous, is actually a sign of their moral integrity. And that's a really bad idea. So, you know, if you're an axe murderer but you don't have an axe, that doesn't mean that you're moral. So now, with regards to, so that's the persona. And the persona is the mask that you wear, and that's what persona means, is the mask that you wear to convince yourself and the world that you're not a terrible monster, so that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't have to run away screaming. You know, and you might think, well, that's a bit of an overstatement, but Jung was very interested in phenomena such as, say, the psychological phenomena that would characterize the actions of someone who might be an Auschwitz camp guard, for example. And, that's a pretty monstrous form of behavior. And the thing about Auschwitz camp guards is that there's no reason to assume, really, that they were much different than normal people. Now, there would have been exceptions, obviously, and what that means is that perhaps you too could be an Auschwitz camp guard, and perhaps you would even derive some enjoyment out of it, and you might think not, but you shouldn't think not so quickly. And what that also implies is that if you could see what that meant when you looked in the mirror and looked at yourself, you might run away screaming, because you'd have a revelation of just exactly what the human being is capable of. And that's a very unpleasant revelation, and also one of the things that stops people from being enlightened, because that revelation of the evil of the self is part of the journey to enlightenment, and an early part. Now, the shadow would be all the parts of the personality that the persona rejects, and that might be the aggressive elements. Certainly that's the case for people who are hyper-agreeable. And now you can tell, I think one of the best, there's two pathways to the development of the shadow, and they're tightly allied with one another. The fundamental pathway is truth, and that's to face the bitter truth about yourself. But to break that down more particularly, you might think about that as the capacity to observe your own resentment. You're going to be resentful and bitter in many situations because you don't get what you want. And if you watch that resentment and bitterness, you'll see that it produces fantasies that can be unbelievably dark. And that can be very frightening, and you might not want to admit to yourself that you're actually capable of having fantasies like that, or impulses like that, or aggressive feelings like that. But the thing is that if those aggressive feelings and impulses and fantasies are integrated into your character, it's like you're opening up a dialogue with a part of yourself that can be very forceful and strong and dangerous. And it's really useful to be dangerous, because if you can be dangerous, you often don't have to be. And it's often weak people. For example, it's weak men, generally speaking, who rape. That's a very, very common occurrence, and that's a violent act, but it's born out of weakness, not out of strength, that's for sure. And so, anyways, you attend to your resentment honestly, and you observe yourself and what you're actually like. You got to pay attention as if you don't know yourself, as if you might harbor hidden devils, and then maybe they'll emerge. Now, Jung also felt that sort of embedded inside the shadow were the contrasexual tendencies. And so, for example, sometimes you see people who are well-developed, men, let's say, and we can also talk about women in this regard. Men who've integrated their shadow often also develop a kind of peculiar grace that would be a consequence of not only allowing their aggressive side to step forward, but also their feminine and compassionate side that they may have kept squelched because of embarrassment about it, or because they'd been harassed for being weak, or any number of things. So, but the practical approach for developing your shadow, I would say, is to contemplate and consider your resentment and notice what it says. And because your resentment will also tell you what you have to say. So look at what happened at Google this weekend. James Damore wrote that memo, and you can imagine he was pretty angry and perhaps even somewhat resentful at having to attend that diversity seminar. And I'm really just using this as an example. But what he did was decide that meant that he had something that he had to say, and then look at the consequences of that, man. It's absolutely unbelievable. And so, if you're feeling oppressed at work, or you're oppressed in your life, or you're oppressing yourself, then you got to notice that you're feeling oppressed. Then you have to notice that you're feeling resentful and angry and bitter, and maybe even like Cain in the story of Cain and Abel, because Cain is sort of the archetypal bitter man. And then you have to decide what it is that you need to do in order to remove from yourself that bitterness. And that usually means that there's something that you have to say. And then you have to say it because your soul depends on it. And not only does your soul depend on it, I would say the fate of the world depends on it. Because, you might be wrong, and then you should be straightened out. Maybe you're just being whiny and you have to talk to somebody about that. But it may be that you're actually detecting something wrong, some tyranny that's directed towards you and other people, and it's like your moral obligation to speak up about it. And so many workplaces become toxic, to use a terrible cliche, because the people in them won't speak up for what they actually want, or they speak up too late, and then they're all twisted up about it, and they're torturing other people because they're so unhappy, and so forth and so on. So, practical approach for developing your shadow fundamentally is radical honesty. And Jung said that a genuine moral effort was a good substitute for psychotherapy.
Now, I have a bunch of shadow work tools as well as anima integration, animus integration, and self-integration tools later on in the video. But for now, let's go ahead and jump into stage 2. Integrate the anima, or animus. The animus is the masculine archetype or partial personality in a woman, and the anima is the feminine component of a man's personality. Jung tells us that the anima and animus are enlivening souls or spirits within men and women. He said that the encounter with the shadow is the apprentice piece in the individual's development, and that with the anima is the masterpiece. These are Jung's levels of anima development. Jung believed anima development has 4 distinct levels, which in the psychology of transference he named Eve, Helen, Mary, and Sophia. In broad terms, the entire process of anima development in a man is about the man opening up to emotionality, and in that way, opening up to a broader sort of spirituality through creativity, imagination, intuitive processes, and psychic sensitivity towards oneself and others. The first step in anima integration is Eve, object of desire or provider of nourishment, security, and love. This step is named, of course, after the Genesis account of Adam and Eve. Eve in particular, of course. It deals with the emergence of a man's object of desire. The anima is completely tied up with a woman as provider of nourishment, security, and love. The man at this anima level cannot function well without a woman, and is more likely to be controlled by her, or more likely by his own imaginary construction of her. He's often impotent or has no sexual desire. The second stage of development or integration is Helen, the worldly achiever, intelligent and talented. Helen is an allusion to Helen of Troy in Greek mythology. In this phase, women are viewed as capable of worldly success and of being self-reliant, intelligent, and insightful, even if not altogether virtuous. This second phase is meant to show a strong schism in external talent with lacking internal qualities. The third stage is Mary, the righteous and a paragon of virtue. This phase, of course, is named after the Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother. At this level, women can now seem to possess virtue by the perceiving man, even if in an esoteric or dogmatic way, inasmuch as certain activities deemed consciously unvirtuous cannot be applied to her. And then last but not least, we have Sophia, which is wisdom in the wisdom literature of Proverbs. Wise and fully human, equal and not at all an object. Complete integration has now occurred, which allows women to be seen and related to as particular individuals who possess both positive and negative qualities. The most important aspect of this final level is that, as the personification wisdom suggests, the anima is now developed enough that no single object can fully and permanently contain the images to which it is related.
So what does it mean for this symbol to emerge from the feminine symbol, let's say, to emerge from chaos? Well, this is a picture of Venus, the goddess of love, right? And so I cut this picture out of a larger picture, and it's Venus manifesting herself in a transcendent space, in the sky, in the same way that Christ did in the previous representation. And she has rays coming off her, and there's all these men who are knights kneeling in front of the image. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that men use the image of female perfection to motivate themselves. And that's exactly right. That's precisely what they do. You see that in the Tom Sawyer story. So Tom Sawyer is about 12 years old, and he's still hanging around with his friends like Huck Finn. And this girl moves across the street, Becky, and she comes out, and he's struck by her for the first time in his life. Something's changed. And the first thing he does is hop up on a picket fence and show off and balance in front of her. And he's saying, well, look at me, look at me. He's like the male bowerbird building something beautiful so the female will approve of it. And it's motivation. You know, and that's something that I think modern women don't really understand about men. They don't understand that at least to the degree that males are uncorrupted and not bitter because of being rejected, they're doing everything they can to kneel before the eternal image of the feminine and try to make themselves worthy. That's the chivalry story, right? That's what you should encourage in your partner. So out of chaos emerges this first form. It's the feminine form. It's partly the form that represents novelty as such. So, and on one hand it's promise, on the other hand it's threat. That you wouldn't believe, and I don't know, because I don't understand the situation with women as well as I understand the situation with men, obviously, being a man. But I don't know if women have any idea how paralyzing they are to especially young men. A very large number of my clinical clients, but also young men I've talked to in general, are absolutely terrified of women because they're terrified of being rejected. And the terror exists in precise proportion to the attraction to the woman, which is a horrible paradoxical situation to be in. It's often why men make such fools of themselves in front of women that they're attracted to. It's because, first of all, they don't see the woman that they're attracted to, because what the hell do they know about her? They don't see her as an individual. They see her as the manifestation of a judgmental ideal. And then it's only in establishing the relationship with the actual woman that they can start differentiating between the judgmental ideal and the actual individual woman. And that also requires a sacrifice. And the sacrifice is, you never can have an ideal woman. So to have a relationship with any woman, you have to sacrifice the relationship with the ideal woman, and you have to see the individual woman and separate her from the ideal. And that's the same thing that happens to the hero in Sleeping Beauty, right? He sees the evil queen who actually turns into the dragon of chaos, and it's not until he can defeat her that he can establish a relationship with the actual princess. And that's exactly the case. I had one of my clients who ran this men's group, which was quite interesting. One of the things they had the initiates do, which was very intelligent, was to go out and ask 50 women in one day for their phone numbers. Why? Politely, properly, you know. It was a game, but it wasn't a stupid game. And the idea was, get over your fear of rejection. And how do you do that? By encountering it continually and continually and continually, so that you're no longer paralyzed by this. All right, so then we go to the next representation. This is Kali, K-A-L-I, Hindu goddess of destruction. She's the thing that you encounter, she's the thing that makes things go bump in the night. What is that thing? Well, let's take it apart a little bit. She's in a container of fire. Why fire? Well, fire is useful and destructive, right? And you also cannot look away from fire. And so it's a really good symbol of that which you cannot look away from. And then inside the fire, these are skulls. You see them? All lined up there. So it's not just fire, it's the fire of death that consumes. So that's where Kelly lives. So that's fun to start with. And then there she is with her hair on fire, because her hair's on fire, in case she isn't frightening enough just because of where she lives. Her hair's on fire, and her headdress is made out of skulls. That's horror. It's a representation of horror and death and destruction and transformation. It's feminine as well. What do you do in the face of Mother Nature? That's another negative element of Mother Nature. What do you do with something like this? Well, that's the eternal question. And the answer is quite straightforward. You make sacrifices to her. And if you make the proper sacrifices, then she turns into her beneficial counterpart. And that's exactly what you do in life. If in the face of horror and death, you make sacrifices, so you transform the terrible destructive element of nature into that thing that continually offers you what you need. That discovery is one of unparalleled brilliance. Well, that's a representation of Diana. You could think of Diana, there's an opposite, Durga, in Hinduism, and she comes forth if you make the proper sacrifices to Kali. But I wanted to show you alternative representations from different cultures of these archetypal forms. This is Diana, positive feminine, multi-breasted, right? She's the thing that nourishes the world, and so that would be, on one hand, your mother, who obviously protects you from the terrible aspects of fire and danger, but also nature conceptualized as the positive feminine in general. The source of all fertility and all food and all beings and all good things. Something that you want to have on your side, that's for sure. And you might say, if you acted heroically, properly, and you played the metagame and not the game, and you made the proper sacrifices, then you'd never encounter Kelly, you'd only encounter her benevolent counterpart. And so then you might say, well, does she even exist then? And that's something that's very interesting, is because the degree to which the terrible part of the world manifests itself in your life is proportionate to how insufficient you are. And we don't know the full extent of that. If you got your act together completely, maybe all the suffering would disappear from your life, or at least maybe all the unbearable suffering, and maybe all the suffering or the unbearable suffering from the lives of people around you too. And you already know that because there are people that you'll go to in a crisis that you can rely on, and you know they'll help you, and you wonder what the world would be like if you were like that and everyone else was like that too. We'd have a lot fewer crises, and the ones that we do have would be a lot more manageable. And so when people say, well, why is the world so rife with suffering, one answer to that is because we're not yet what we could be. And at least that's an answer that we have some control over, right? You're not going to talk God out of making the world suffer, that's for sure. And you're not going to negotiate directly with Mother Nature, but you might be able to put yourself together a little bit and see if that works. At least it's under your control. And God only knows what the upper limit of that might be. Well, here's the decomposition of the fundamental archetype. The dragon of chaos differentiates, on the one hand, into the feminine, that's the unknown, and the feminine differentiates further into the negative feminine and the positive feminine.